Well, I take that back. It's now 10 a.m. And welcome to our guests for another of the Trucking Network series of webinars. Today, I think we have a timely topic, the impact of COVID-19 on the trucking industry. And with that, I would like our guests to introduce themselves. So I'll turn it over to Angela.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And thanks, Naveen, for hosting us. My name is Angela Splinter. I'm the CEO at Trucking HR Canada. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a national not-for-profit organization. And we do a variety of different initiatives, all focused on human resources. We partner with government organizations, with industry associations, and others to really ensure the industry is prepared with the workers that it needs today and into the future. So labor market information, which we'll be talking about today, is one of our key strategic areas of focus. We also do work around occupational standards, do support generally with human resources management, particularly with small and medium-sized fleets. And we have a variety of other initiatives, our Top Fleet Employer Program, trying through our Women with Drive initiative, bringing more women into the industry, and also just recently launched a wage subsidy program. So a lot of different initiatives. Feel free to check out our website if you're interested. And I know today you're interested in learning about labor market information. So what I'm going to do is just provide an overview. So if we just turn it to the next slide, Craig has pulled together a lot of good information for you today. So I'll provide that overview of the approach that we take here at Trucking HR Canada with our labor market information, why it matters, why it should matter to you. And then Craig will go into a lot of other detail on all of the variety of research and findings that we have. And well, of course, we will have time at the end to answer any of your questions. And if we don't have time within the allotted time, you can always reach out to either Naveen or myself, and we're available to answer those questions. So essentially, what we're going to do today is, as I mentioned, a high-level overview of our labor market information initiative, and then also how we've used our labor market information to really assess how our industry has been impacted and affected by COVID-19. Clearly within your workplaces, there have been impacts with HR and health and safety practices, but there's also been a lot of changes with employment levels, which we will get into. And we'll just talk a bit again about what it means for the industry, what it means for you, where we've been and kind of where we're going. So before I go into that, or before Craig goes into that, I'll just share sort of a high-level overview of our labor market initiative. So basically what labor market information is actionable intelligence pertaining to the supply and demand of labor, right? So it takes raw data and puts it into context so that we can facilitate better and evidence-based decisions. This helps employers make better decisions, employees, right, potential job seekers, because we can identify, right, those jobs in need. It helps educators, right, so what jobs do we need to be training people for? So it really helps us in just, you know, getting a better handle on the information and how we can better respond to it. And the approach we take here at Trucking HR Canada is we look at all of the publicly available sources of information. So that includes Stats Canada data, the labor force surveys, etc. And we have to balance that with more detailed analysis. So for example, with that primary data with reaching to employers. So as an example, one thing I've learned over the last few years is, particularly at the government level, our industry is largely misunderstood, right? We talk about the driver shortage, and we've been talking about it anecdotally, but our labor market information has really enabled us to quantify this shortage. Right now, it can't be refuted. And what we learned too is that the publicly available sources of data, that's been part of the problem, because that data doesn't tell the whole story, right? It gives broad numbers on transportation. But what we've learned is we need to dig deeper to get the information, particularly on truck driver employment. And it's a difficult task, I will say. It took us a long time to get all of this information together so we can do that. So as an example, when we do a data request now, so for example, the labor market snapshot we released this week, based on the labor force survey from August, for us to get down to the granular level of truck driver employment, we have to do custom data requests. I won't go into the minutiae of how we do it all, but just to show that, right, we've got a methodology around our LMI, and it helps the industry because now we all have consistent information. We can all be singing from the same song sheet. So when we're talking about shortages, when we break it down by province, we can compare that data and it just makes it better. So it's evidence-based, right? So in addition to that research that we've done, there's a variety of other reports that make up our overall labor market information, which you might be familiar with. One is the millennial work, assessing what millennials think of our industry, because we know they aren't lining up to come in and work in trucking, particularly as drivers. So we work with Abacus Data on doing some of that work, and it really helps round out all of our information. So there are different reports we have available. The millennials have Drive 2. The other one, the most comprehensive one, is called The Road Ahead. And interestingly enough, we released that literally the day before the pandemic was declared, but still very valuable and good information. And we were still working with the conference board on completing that research. So we were in a really good position to do an immediate pivot, which we did. And that pivot was, okay, now we have to assess the impacts of COVID-19, right? We know our industry went from acute labor shortages to layoffs literally overnight. And that does have an impact on business operations. So we assessed that with employers. We went out and surveyed employers again. We also did more research on the data side with the Conference Board of Canada to really, look at the other economic modeling they were doing at the time and focus specifically on trucking and logistics. So that is sort of at a high level. This is all of the research that we're doing. And as you'll see soon, it really does provide us with really good information that is really helpful. So I'm going to turn it over to Craig, and he can start going into more of those details on what these findings mean, and how you can start using some of this information.
Thanks, Angela. My name is Craig Fawcett. I am the Director of Policies and Programs with Trucking HR Canada. And part of my job, or part of my responsibilities, is to help lead our Labour Market Information Project, working in conjunction with Angela and our team here at Trucking HR Canada. So it's my privilege today to go through some of that detail with you about what we had seen as the effects on the labour market due to COVID-19, and a little bit about what we see into the future, what's sort of happening today. Things have changed a little bit, especially compared to the springtime, and a bit of some forecasting about what may be lying ahead as we move forward. So to kind of provide a bit of context, when we went into the pandemic in the beginning, we saw kind of a bit of a perfect storm, especially from the employer's perspective. So what we had seen was initial surges in demand to move freight, and that was basically to address any shortages that we had seen within the supply chain. But that was actually also, essentially, as everyone would have probably lived through, came up against new health and safety protocols. There was also travel, food, and restaurant restrictions in place, which made it very difficult for employers to navigate through that initial kind of surge and determine how they're able to move forward. And that then changed fairly quickly over about a month or so into employers having to now make difficult decisions on laying off workers or reducing work hours, which resulted in a fairly significant reduction in the number of truck drivers and other workers within our industry. So that was basically what happened through March, April, May, and partly into June. But as Angela had mentioned, that basically came on the heels of what we had shown in March, especially, was a significant labor shortage within the industry. We had put together our labor market forecast in January 2020 and released it, as Angela mentioned, just 2 days before the pandemic hit. And what it had demonstrated was that our industry was suffering from a significant shortage, especially of truck drivers, and that now would be a concern for our industry moving forward. But now that we see, because of the pandemic, that may have changed a little bit, and we wanted to provide or do some research to determine exactly how that may have changed. So essentially our research methodology took essentially two forms. We did an employer survey where we collected those survey results from May 22nd to May 31st in 2020. We ended up having 84 unique employer responses to the survey, and they represented an entire employee group of about 26,000 employees. So it was a fairly good representative number within the industry. Clearly we didn't survey every single employer, but we got a good representation across the board that would allow us to draw some fairly meaningful conclusions and insights into what was happening within the industry. Then we also went back and decided to readjust our employment forecasts. So as we had said, we did our forecasts in January, released them in March, but we knew that the pandemic would have an impact on those. And what we wanted to determine was the impact a shock, essentially, so kind of a blip within our forecasting and what will happen in employment to our industry, or is it representing more of a structural change in how employment will be in our industry moving forward? So we went back, looked at new LFS data that came out in April, May, and June, along with our employer survey, and we're able to update our forecast, which I'll get into in a little bit of greater detail. So that forecast is not just based upon those numbers, but also look at the GDP forecasts for other sectors that our industry is dependent upon. So we looked at industries like manufacturing, agricultural, forestry, fisheries, other extractive industries, retail and wholesale trade and construction. So essentially we do know that our industry kind of goes as other industries go too. So if other industries are recovering, then ours will as well, because essentially we're kind of the backbone of those industries being able to recover and be able to grow. So those are basically how we're able to put together our forecast. So the survey sample itself had a fairly good, strong cross-representation, and we looked at it from basically three different kind of categories. We wanted to ensure that we had good representation across the country, so which we are essentially able to do primarily. We were a bit overrepresented from Ontario employers, where they made up over 45% of the respondents, but that's clearly a little higher than Ontario's share of the Canadian population. We were a bit underrepresented in Quebec, and the one province where we didn't have any respondents was actually PEI. But overall, is a very good response. We had a good, strong response from provinces like British Columbia, Manitoba, even Nova Scotia, and so on. So we also have a good representation around the industries that the employers are supporting. So 28% of our employers who responded to the survey support the manufacturing industry. 12% was for food retail. Construction was 11, agricultural 6, oil and gas 6, and wholesale 5. So again, it gave a good cross representation of all the industries that our industry supports. The last big question that we wanted to ask was that we wanted to understand if there were differences in employers who were moving essential goods compared to employers who were moving non-essential goods. Because we had known from the beginning of the pandemic that there's still a critical need for essential goods to be moved and to be brought to the marketplace, just because Canadians needed those. So we knew that grocery stores, pharmacies, and so on still had to operate in very similar ways, or had operated at similar capacities, if not at greater capacities than they did before the pandemic. So we wanted to see what kind of impact did that have on the industry. We would expect that the industry would maybe be impacted differently if they were moving essential goods or not. So at least we're able to find out in the representation side that about 50% of the employers who responded to our survey were moving essential goods, while the other 50% were not. So that gave us a good breakdown between the two to be able to ascertain some of the impacts between how employers were affected and whether they were moving those goods or not. So now I'll kind of go into some of the impacts that the COVID-19 had on employment, especially during the early stages for our industry. So what we have found was that 75% of our survey respondents had laid off staff, either temporarily or permanently, and that truck drivers had made up about 70% of those layoffs. That's a bit of an interesting number in that our industry, we expected that truck drivers would make up the bulk of those layoffs, but it actually is a bit of an overrepresentation, because I believe truck drivers normally make up about 40 to 45%, depending on the year, of our entire workforce, but they were actually making up 70% overall of the entire layoffs within our industry. So they were a bit overrepresented in that number. We had also found that this represented that truck driver employment fell by 11.4%, and that we had found that about 8.2% of our entire workforce was laid off. Now that sounded like fairly significant numbers at the time, but to put it in a bit of perspective, at that same period in April 2020, about 15.8% of the entire Canadian workforce was actually laid off, either permanently or temporarily. So although we saw significant layoffs in our industry, we were essentially let off a little bit easier, if I may say, compared to other industries and the economy as a whole. So although it was really bad, it could have, if I may say, it could have been a lot worse. The other key finding that we had found within the survey was that about 60% of employers were also reducing the working hours for employees. So that meant that some employers were doing both, laying off staff and reducing work hours, while other employers were using hour reductions as a way of mitigating the number or any layoffs that they would have to take place. What we also found was that the layoffs were not evenly distributed across the entire industry, and certain segments within our industry were impacted a little bit greater than others. So what we found was that there was a concentration and decline for employers who were moving non-essential goods. They had laid off a total of about 10% of their workforce, while employers who are moving essential goods only laid off about 5.5% of their workforce. So we saw that employers who were maybe not moving as much goods as they were before during the first stages of the pandemic were having to lay off more workers than employers who were able to hold on to more contracts and move more goods. We also found that short-haul drivers experience a higher set of layoffs compared to long-haul drivers. So about 11% of short-haul drivers were laid off compared to only 8% of long-haul. So we're not quite sure why this was the case, but it seemed to be that short-haul drivers were more significantly impacted in the early stages of the pandemic compared to long haul. Our assumption is that long haul movement of goods, especially cross-border, was still very important to the industry, especially to our supply chain. So it meant that there was less layoffs within long haul drivers. I will point out here, though, that our definition between short haul and long haul is fairly specific. We do define that as long haul as being away from home 1 night a week or more, while short haul will be home every night. We do know that the industry defines this a little bit differently depending on where you are or who you talk to, but we felt that that was a reasonable definition that we had used in previous surveys, and we've been trying to stick with that for consistency purposes. We also noticed that about 10% of mechanics and dispatchers were laid off as well. So what we found too is that the layoffs were also were very unevenly distributed around different types of industries that our employers supported. So what we found here was that in the manufacturing industry especially, about 70% of the workers from employers who support that industry were laid off, which is significantly higher than the average and is significantly higher than other industries. So by comparison, only 4.6% of workers within the primary resource, within employers who work within primary resource extraction like oil and gas, forestry, agriculture, and mining were laid off. So we saw there that there was definitely an unequal distribution of those layoffs. Our best guess to that, or what we had seen with that, is that obviously manufacturing took a very strong hit at the beginning of the pandemic, where a lot of manufacturing sector was closing down, at least temporarily, and that meant a softening there that required more layoffs from employers to accommodate that. So on top of the employer-initiated departures, so that be layoffs either permanently or temporarily, we also found that there was a significant number of employee-initiated departures as well, and that represented about 2.5% of drivers leaving the industry, at least either temporarily or permanently, were actually were employee-initiated. The biggest concern that we had heard from employers through this was that a number of these individuals had expressed a desire not to come back to their positions later on down the road. So that was a concern that they may not be able to, they would have to then try to replace those drivers at a later date. And the main reasons for why drivers were leaving that they had given us was that they were looking to either self-quarantine at the time. They were either at high risk for getting COVID-19 or having complications because of COVID-19, again, for themselves or their family members. But we also had heard too that a number of people were either taking temporary layoffs because of family caregiving. As we had all in the beginning stages of the pandemic had to take on greater caregiving needs for our families, drivers were experiencing the same and therefore having to not be on the road in order to provide that caregiving at home while schools and daycares were being shut down. So as I mentioned, in addition to the layoffs, many employers were also looking to reduce hours. So we had to look, just about 60% of our employers reduce hours of their employees over the beginning stages of the pandemic. Interestingly enough, about 10% of our employers actually increased their hours. So we assume obviously that their business was picking up or was stronger, probably because they were moving those essential goods, and therefore they had to increase their worker hours, which at the same time would also create stress on those workers because of having to deal with the new safety protocols, a lot of the unknowns happening within our environment, and then having to work longer hours to be able to move those goods. So we also asked employers through this survey if they can kind of give us a sense of, what were they expecting to happen over the next 3 to 6 months. So what we had found was that about a third of our survey respondents were likely to lay off additional employees over the next 3 to 6 months. And again, that was not very well evenly distributed. And what we were tending to find was that employers who were already having layoffs were expecting to be able to have more. So about 43% of those employers who had already laid off workers were expected to lay off more. And that compared only to about 16% of employers who hadn't experienced layoffs yet, where they were anticipating layoffs to come into the future. Also, we found that employers were more likely to lay off drivers first. At about 87% of employers indicated that, compared to only about 57% of employers who were expecting to lay off mechanics first or dispatchers first. So we tended to find again that the driver was going to be the one occupation that would be experiencing more of those layoffs moving forward if they needed to take place. So that gives a bit of a snapshot, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, of what happened to employment. Obviously, what we had seen was significant contraction, especially in the truck driver occupation, where we had seen, close to double-digit layoffs within our industry, especially for truck drivers, and about an 8% contraction for the industry as a whole. And although that was really significant and a major impact on our industry, we were less severely impacted compared to the economy as a whole in Canada, and didn't experience the same level of contraction that other industries had experienced, or the economy as a whole as well. And what even though we had found that was a little bit smaller, it was still significant for our employers. I mean, we had talked to many employers throughout the early stages of the pandemic who were, trying to determine how they were able to make those layoffs. What ESA or federal or Canada Labor Code rules that they needed to follow, because they had said, we've never made layoffs in our entire careers. It's not something we've ever done, so we weren't really sure even how to do it. So it was a significant change for a lot of employers to have to address. So on top of some of those employment changes, we also wanted to understand the impact on other kind of HR practices within the industry. So we also, within our survey, we asked some questions around that as well. So the first question, one of the first things that we found was that there was also some significant changes around compensation and compensation strategies that was a response to COVID-19. So what we had found was that about 23% of employers had actually frozen the wages of their employees, either some or whole, during the first part of the pandemic. And again, that was more represented by employers who are moving non-essential goods, where 31% of those employers had frozen wages, compared to only 15% of employers who were moving essential goods. Another 15% of employers had reduced wages during that time. Again, it was 21% of non-essential goods, or employers who were moving non-essential goods, compared to only 12% of employers who were moving essential goods. Conversely, 5% of employers had increased wages. Now, when we say an increase to wage, was that essentially as a permanent increase to the wage of their drivers or their other employees? So 5% had done that. while another 13% of employers had offered drivers a pay premium. So that would have been a temporary increase to their wage. We've heard it, called hero pay. There's been different kind of, pandemic pay and so on. So 13% of employers had done that as well. A number of other fleets were offering other types of rewards to their employees. So 21% were offering non-monetary rewards or incentives. That was either flex time, offering some versions of childcare or time off. And then another 15% of employers were actually offering other types of monetary rewards like gift cards. So we had heard from some employers that they had offered gift cards to grocery stores or other types of gift cards to their employees as an incentive or as a thank you for all the extra hard work that they had done during the early stages of the pandemic. In addition, about 10% of employers had either frozen pay bonuses, had made some changes to their pension or benefit plans. Some had delayed compensation, just under 10%, while another 11% introduced temporary cost-saving measures such as mandatory vacation. And then, interestingly enough, about another 20% of employers essentially just stayed the course and made no changes at all. Interestingly enough, it was about 27% of employers who were moving essential goods had made no changes whatsoever, just kind of stayed the course, while 15% of employers moving non-essential goods had just stayed the course. Clearly, more of those employers moving non-essential goods felt a need to make changes to their compensation structure in order to accommodate the severe changes based upon the pandemic. We had also asked employers too about what they had seen, what they thought might be some of the challenges with either training or onboarding new employees over the next 3 to 6 months, and whether they saw any changes around recruitment as well. So about 65% of employers expected that training would become either more of a challenge than before COVID-19. Clearly, they were indicating concerns around the need for physical distancing and the need for more virtual training. And about 55% thought that onboarding would become more challenging. I wonder today, as a side note, if we had done this survey in September with some of the challenges that back to school have had, if that percentage might be a lot higher. But clearly there were concerns about driver training schools being able to stay open, be able to have the same capacity that they had before. And that was a concern that employers were worried that they would not be able to have the same number of drivers receiving the training that they needed. As I mentioned, we also asked around recruitment challenges as well. And what was interesting here is that employers kind of gave a bit of a mixed message to this one, where they felt that recruitment would basically be about the same or less difficult over the next 3 to 6 months. And the reasons why they gave around this was that they figured there'll be a decreased demand for trucking services, so maybe a less need to hire. That may not have played out the way that people were anticipating, as we'll get to into a few more slides. But they also felt that it might be easier to find laid-off workers from other industries. So they felt that there's maybe an opportunity here to pull workers from other industries who were, who had experienced layoffs, where if they were able to hire and bring them on into their fleet. So that kind of gives a bit of a picture about what was happening in the early stages of the pandemic and how employers and employment within the industry is essentially impacted. So our next step then was to understand a little bit about what would this mean for the industry moving forward. So part of the labor market information work that we do is not just to provide snapshots of what's happening today or maybe happened yesterday or at different points in time, but we also want to get a sense of what will be happening into the future, because being able to provide some of that forecast or modeling allows for better decision making, because we can know, okay, this is what's happening today, but if nothing changes and we just go on the same course into the future, then this is what we can anticipate would be able to happen. And that allows us to, to determine what types of interventions and changes we may need to take place in order to maybe, change that future world that we are essentially predicting or forecasting. So as Angela had mentioned, that we had done an initial labor market forecast in January of 2020. And published those results in March, again, 2 days before the pandemic. The timing to us is still always very interesting. And what we had found at that time was that employment within the industry was going to rise to about 714,000 workers by 2023. And given our analysis at that time of the supply of workers, both workers coming into the industry and workers leaving the industry, what we had found was that there was going to be a shortage that was going to increase significantly. We already had a shortage in 2018 of 30,500 workers for our industry. And we were expecting that that shortage or that vacancy would actually rise to 38,900 by 2023. So that was the picture of our industry going into the pandemic, an industry that was suffering from, significant acute shortages that we were anticipating were only going to grow over the next 3 years or so. So now that the pandemic has hit and we had found that, we've seen significant contraction, at least on a temporary basis, well, what would that mean for that forecast? Is the forecast going to change entirely, or is it, or is it going to essentially look the same, but maybe move in a slightly different direction? So we redid that forecasting to kind of make that determination. So this graph here shows some of that forecast for employment within our industry. So according to our updated model, what we had saw during the first 2 quarters of 2020 was a severe contraction within it of about 10.4%, or the loss of about 72,000 jobs due to COVID-19. So that meant that what we were looking at was at a peak of 695,000 workers at the end of Q4 in 2019, our industry would contract to 23,000 workers by the end of the second quarter of 2020. So interestingly enough, this estimate aligns with the results of our employer survey, where we were anticipating that exact same 10.4% contraction in jobs within the industry. But what we were anticipating was, starting in the third quarter of 2020, we were expecting employment to start to begin to recover as other industries closed by COVID-19 began to reopen. So what we were expecting was a gradual or a continual recovery over the next few months, and then again over the next few years, where essentially employment within the trucking and logistics industry would stabilize by that first quarter of 2022 and remain about 1% below the pre-COVID levels through 2023. So we weren't going to get back up to the same forecast that we had shown before, but we're going to get very close to that for the industry as a whole. So what we had found too was that those job losses would be seen a little bit different across the board. So there's about 10.9% contraction of employment among truck drivers and a 10% decline among non-truck driving occupations within the industry. So we would find that it was mostly drivers would be most impacted by those contractions, and then other occupations as well. What that meant was that truck drivers were expected to account for about 34,700 of those job losses, or about 1 in 2 COVID-related job losses for the industry. On the other hand, interestingly enough, delivery and courier drivers were forecasted to experience a below average decline in employment. And this was likely due to the shift towards online shopping to comply with social distancing. So we only anticipated about 7,500 job losses in this occupation. And that was mostly due to very negative GDP outlooks for retail and wholesale trade that was impacted by COVID. Even though we were seeing that shift to more online shopping, there was still a contraction in retail and wholesale trade that would reduce the same amount of demand for courier and delivery drivers. So even so that meant that there would be that job loss would be not as significant as, say, for truck drivers or other occupations in the industry, but there will still be some loss, just not as great. What we had also found was that that the amount of job losses would be different depending on the industries that that we were working within. So the truck transportation industry as a whole would see about 30,000 of those job losses, or about 43%. And that's represented by those orange bars there. About another 18,600 truck and logistics jobs would have been lost in retail and wholesale trade industries, and then another 8, which would represent about 26%. The manufacturing industry, which is represented by the first lighter blue bar, would shed about 5,200 workers, and then warehousing and storage another 5,100 workers as well. So what we then wanted to take a look at was, how would these losses and, the recovery look at, as far as our initial kind of COVID estimate looked. So this graph here shows both sets of numbers. So the blue number represents our updated estimate. Clearly the numbers before 2020 are actual numbers of how the industry employment levels had changed from 2015 to 2020. And then the continuation of that blue line shows that dip that we were forecasting in 2020 and that recovery through 2022 into 2023. And then the yellow or the orange line represents our pre-COVID estimate. So clearly we are seeing that big dip, but that recovery was starting to happen already in 2020, and then we would be about a 1% percentage below where we were by 2022 and 2023. Interestingly enough, that when we looked at truck drivers as a specific occupation within the industry, we noticed that we actually were going to exceed our pre-COVID estimate by around 2023, which was quite a surprise to us. So although we would see this significant dip, and again, represented by that blue line, we were noticing that actually our employment levels within the truck driver occupation were going to exceed our pre-COVID estimates, meaning that essentially the same labor shortages that we had forecasted before COVID-19 had hit will be returning to the industry at some point into the near future. So what this meant for us was that essentially COVID-19 represented a significant shock to employment within the trucking and logistics industry, but it didn't represent a structural change to employment. Essentially just meant that things are going to shift for a period of time, but if we don't make any other changes within the industry, we're going to essentially return to the same shortages not too many years down the road. So that was basically the forecast that we had developed in June and July of 2020, just to get a sense of where things were going to be moving over the next couple of years. So as we do that kind of forecast, our next kind of step is to continue to monitor the labor market within the industry to see, partly to, to pin, what actually happens within the industry compared to that forecast. But then that allows us to make any maybe adjustments to the forecast as we move forward. So as Angela had mentioned, we had just released this week a labor market snapshot that looks at labor force survey data that's compiled by Stats Canada that was released. That data is released monthly, usually around the 8th or 9th of each month, and looking at survey data from the previous month. So basically, we now know what's happened for employment for our industry, essentially starting or up to August 2020. So what we had found was that essentially from this graph here, as you can see, although that we've seen that kind of sharp decline in employment up to June 2020, employment is actually increasing significantly from June until August. So essentially here what we've seen is that between June and August, the industry has added 43,500 employed truck drivers back into our industry. So that looks like we have, are starting to hire back all of those laid off workers, and then potentially more so after that. The industry had also added about 23,000 truck drivers just between July and August alone. So that pace has actually picked up significantly over the last just 2 months or so. And this represents a 7.7% increase in employment for that truck driver occupation. So as you can see from the graph here, the orange line represents the 10-year average for employment for truck drivers in the industry. And the blue line is actually the actual truck driver employment. So we're actually now already exceeding that 10-year average this, early on into the recovery after the first kind of stages of the pandemic. And I would say that actually the performance of employment for truck drivers especially actually is outstripping our initial forecast. So we're actually seeing a more significant or an earlier recovery than we had anticipated through our initial forecast. So on the converse side, we also were looking at the unemployment rate as well. So the number of unemployed truck drivers actually decreased over the same period by about 30,000 to almost 10,000, or by about 10,000 people. So that meant that the unemployment rate for drivers decreased from sharply from a high of about 12% in June to about 6.3% in August, which actually puts it at the structural floor of unemployment within Canada. So what we mean by the structural floor is that every industry and every occupation will have some unemployment no matter what. And that's partly because, you know, there will be a demand for workers in certain areas, but not enough, but a shortage of workers within that area, while other areas in the country may have more truck drivers and not enough openings and so on. Or that someone who may, you know, call themselves a truck driver and has driven, you know, as a truck driver may not be able to gain further employment in the industry due to concerns on their safety record or whatever else, but are still considered to be unemployed. So there's always going to be some level of unemployment. And what we're finding is actually we're now getting back to that kind of structural floor. So that's a fairly significant return to that in a very short period of time. And I will point out is that for truck drivers especially, that unemployment rate of 6.3% is well below, and not quite half, but almost half of the national unemployment rate, which during the same period sits at 11.4%. So what we have found in the short term is that we are returning very quickly to similar employment levels for truck drivers that we saw pre-COVID. And if that trend continues into the fall, we may be exceeding those numbers sooner than we had anticipated. So what does that mean for the industry moving forward? So I'll now turn this back over to Angela to kind of give a bit of an outlook of what's to come and also a summary of what we had learned so far.
Great, thanks, Craig. So as you can see, a lot of information that we've been working on and compiling over the last little while. And, you know, as Craig mentioned, it helps us determine where we are now, but of course, where we're going to go into the future. So, you know, the second wave of the pandemic, it may have an impact on our labor market forecast. So what we can do there is continue to monitor the monthly labor force surveys so that we can really stay up to date on trends, right? Because clearly what we're seeing now is a trend of truck driver employment that's increasing. We really need to stay on top of that to ensure that as an industry, we can prepare for that. And this data has helped us too in communicating to the federal government as they're looking to support economic recovery. This is an industry that is hiring. And we have seen a lot of young people lose their jobs. We see an opportunity here to, you know, really connect young people to jobs in our industry, right? We have been in the spotlight through the pandemic. So we, you know, were successful in getting the federal government to offer driver training subsidies and wage subsidies for our industry. So we're looking to fill all of those spots, and maybe if we can fill all of those quickly enough, we can get more is our hope. Because what an opportunity for us and for a young person who may have considered working in our industry, that they can access up to $10,000 in getting their training covered, in addition to a wage subsidy of up to $15,000. So really helping employers getting those young people in the door. In addition to the driver occupation, all other occupations within transportation broadly also qualify for that wage subsidy of up to $15,000. So that's an opportunity, and that's, you know, just one example of how the data help us demonstrate what we can do within our industry where there's a need. Just some other things that are coming down the pipeline that I think are worth mentioning. Oh, just one other point on the subsidies. I also want to mention that we also have another special stream of subsidies for any person with a disability. There's no age restriction on the driver training and wage subsidies. It is for anyone up to the age of 30, but our Opportunities Fund, any disability, and really people with disabilities do have a harder time getting into the workforce. Here's an opportunity for us to really bridge that gap too and tap into another labor pool where a wage subsidy of up to $15,000 is available to employers. So other changes that you as employers should be looking out for from our perspective: the changes to the Canada Labour Code. This will be significant. So for all of those who are federally regulated, I'm sure you're well aware of all of the changes that have already happened around flexible work arrangements, work scheduling, notice of schedule changes, overtime, vacation requests, those kinds of things. Pay equity is coming down the pipeline, which will be another big one that our industry will need to pay attention to. But one of the largest ones we're seeing right now is Bill C-65, which looks at the regulations around workplace harassment and violence. So this would be mandatory training for everyone within the federally regulated jurisdiction. So we're working with Labor Canada on some of that training, so stay tuned on that, as well as the pay equity. So our policy analyst, Marisha Tardif, sits on the technical advisory group, working with the Pay Equity Commission on ensuring the needs of our industries are being met there. So different things coming through the pipeline. And of course, when it comes to our labor market information, we're just going to continue to stay on top of it. So feel free to reach out. You know, when you're looking for some of that data, if you need assistance around that, you can reach out to us. And in the interim right now, we're open to other questions that the viewers may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angela. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't finish up for you there, did I, Craig? But I think Craig, sorry, we'll turn it over to you, Chris. This is Craig's summary. He's asking me to deliver it, but it's but really, I think Craig has made, you know, the argument, right, and backed up with the data that what we're seeing is that the driver shortage, you know, it's been delayed by COVID-19 and not negated. So we just want to make sure we're getting that message out, because as an industry, we've been talking about driver shortages for decades. I'm sure there are people on this call that have been talking about it longer than I have. So, but the decade I've been here, there hasn't been a time we're not talking about it. So as I mentioned, I think there's an opportunity here for us to really capitalize on the fact that we are popular, that people may consider working in our industry, and that there's some financial incentives available to do that. In addition, right, the trucking industry is going to continue to face some challenges going through the pandemic. So let's make sure we're staying on top of this labor market information so that we can help employers and help governments understand what is happening within our industry. So now, I'm sorry, Chris, now it's questions.
That's wonderful. That was great. Thank you, both Craig and you, Angela. That was great information. I do have a question myself that I haven't seen in the chat yet. For more information on the subsidies that are available, you mentioned 3. There's a $10,000 one, a $15,000 one, and training for the disabled. So 3 different ones. Can you provide Naveen with a web link for each of those so that our guests can get more information on that?
Sure, we can send it out. It's called the Trucking HR Canada Career Expressway Program. And I just want to clarify the one with people with disabilities. That isn't a training subsidy, that is a wage subsidy for employers. So an employer who is bringing someone on who may have any kind of disability, and they're not always visual disabilities, right? Someone with a mental health disability or something else, some underlying issue, they just sometimes do have a harder time integrating into the workplace. So it's a wage subsidy for the employer as an incentive to help bridge that gap in getting more people with disabilities into the workforce. So it's Career Expressway. We can just send the link out after, or even on our website, truckinghr.com. I believe it's just at the top. If you click on HR training and resources, it should get you through to more information on the Career Expressway program.
Wonderful. And David Henry has a question or a comment. It is training for the disabled. Is this, so you kind of addressed that, it's not really training, it's a wage subsidy.
Yes.
Is this for office staff or drivers? If drivers, what type of disabilities are you talking about?
It's for all occupations, so driving occupations as well as non-driving occupations, and any disability. So maybe Craig can maybe pipe in on this one, because there is a definition that we work with within the context of our funder and that the government uses, if I'm not mistaken.
It's actually fairly open. What we ask for here is just a self-declaration by the employee or the person who will be the participant within the subsidy to self-declare that they have a disability. Again, to Angela's point, it can be a visible or an invisible one. It's as open as and inclusive as they can make it. We don't require as part of this any medical or health forms to justify that there's a disability there, so they don't need to provide, you know, a medical statement from a doctor to say that they have a disability. It's pure self-declaration.
That's very interesting.
And I think that was trying to find a balance between, you know, we want to ensure that we protect the privacy of the participant because they, you know, they're disclosing that information. So another component of that is that we are the only ones who get that information. So we get that from the participant directly. We have it on a form that is only shared between us and the government in a de-identified way. So we'll share the stats of, you know, of what we get, but that information is not shared necessarily with the employer. We leave that up to that participant or that employee to share what information they need to with their employer. We're not going to encroach upon their privacy in that regard.
And always worried about tax dollars and stuff. What checks are there to prevent fraud in that? And this is just something that comes to my mind. If we don't need any medical doctors to say, yes, this person is disabled somehow, what are the checks and balances?
Well, I mean, like I said, it is a self-declaration. You know, we would know who that individual is, and then through an auditing or monitoring process, we have to demonstrate that that all the forms are filled out correctly, and it may require further follow-up with that individual through that audit process to provide greater detail on what that disability was. So we do ask for detail on it. We just don't need a medical form to justify it.
Okay, thank you. And David has a follow-up. Does the subsidy go to the employer or the employee?
The subsidy goes to the employer. So the employer would pay the wages of the employee or participant, and then the subsidy would go to the employer to offset those wage costs, basically. So it's meant to be kind of a kickstart, for lack of a better term, for the employer to bring on someone with a disability to cover some of their wage costs, especially in the beginning as they look to accommodate that individual into their workplace. And then, you know, the expectation would be that that employee would hopefully be able to continue employment afterwards.
Yeah, no, and I applaud the government for doing this because having been in my family, some of these things that you're talking about are there. So I thank the government for that. And Aaron says, hey, thank you to Angela and Craig, both.
Hi, Aaron.
Hi.
And I would agree. Right now, I don't see any other questions. So we may just wrap up early, but before I do that, I'd like to turn it over to Naveen for just a minute and say thank you, Naveen, and the Trucking Network once again for hosting a really great webinar with great guests who happen to present fabulous information. Naveen?
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and a great big thank you to Angela and Craig for sharing this very useful and great information. I think it was a great webinar today, and you had Craig, you had used awesome information. You have shared awesome information today with our attendees. And in the beginning, we apologize. We could not even say welcome to all of our guests and all of our attendees because we knew that Craig has lots of information and we did not want to take his even minute. So yeah, thank you for attending today's webinar. And the next week, on Thursday, we have another great webinar that is on Mark Morrell from Career Edge, and he will be talking about online trainings post-pandemic. So how the online trainings are helping the fleets. So we will talk same time, 10 a.m. Next Thursday, October the 8th. And again, Chris, thank you for making these happen. Thank you again for all of you. Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You're welcome.
It was great, and I've been your moderator, Chris Harris, Safety Dog. With that, I don't see any other questions other than David Henry saying great info. Thanks, Angela and Craig. I would
Hi, David.
like to wrap this webinar up just a couple of minutes early. Thank you all for attending.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela, for spending your time today.